These days, it seems like everyone is just in a twist about Dell's new compression attached memory module, or CAMM as it's known. And I kind of get it, but also I think the time for a new memory packaging standard for laptops its time has come. I mean, with quad channel systems these days, you have to have 4 memory modules, takes up a huge amount of space, and you effectively can't add memory to a system already. There's not room for 8 SODIMMs in a notebook. So you've got 4 populated. If you want to increase the amount of RAM in a notebook, you have to pull them all out and put new ones in, and CAMM isn't going to make that worse. But still, change can be hard, right? And we've had SODIMMs and DIMMs for a really long time. We've lived in an age of relative peace with respect to memory module packaging formats. These modules have been around since, in one form or another, since the late 90s. And there really hasn't been any competition on that front. It's just been each new memory technology has a little tweak to the shape. So you can't put the wrong things in the wrong slots. But other than that, it's been DIMMs and SODIMMs. But we didn't always live in these peaceful times. There was once an age when it was the Wild West and everything was totally out of control. Let's go take a walk back down memory lane. I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but the DIMM had so many advantages over every kind of memory upgrade that ever came before it. But from a user's perspective, it wasn't without its problems. So this is a very old school, ridiculous. I tweeted a picture of this DIMM and the matching one that I have for it quite a while ago. This is 64 megabytes. It's kind of a ridiculous piece of memory, but it is an original 168 pin DIMM, like you would have seen on early Pentium 2 or Super Socket 7 motherboards. Now, these notches on it, called keys, communicate to you what kind of a system this RAM expects to be used in and prevents you from putting it in the wrong thing and something that will damage it. So, and I'm going to compare this with, this is also a 168 pin DIMM from I'm pretty sure that this is for, I know it's for a Sun system. I believe it is for an UltraSpark 1 system. And you can see that these 2 notches are the same, but these 2 are different. Now, this key describes the voltage that this memory wants. And because the key is in the middle position, this memory is 3.3 volt memory, which is almost every DIMM of this kind you'll ever encounter. Except in my SparkStation 5, it wants 5 volt memory, and so the key would be in this position over here. It's also possible to have this position here keyed, but I don't think that was ever defined for anything. Now, these 2 positions are different, indicating the whether or not the memory is buffered. So this is a buffered DIMM, so it's got the key in the middle, and this is unbuffered, so it has the key at the right. What this doesn't describe is that this is DRAM. I believe this is EDO DRAM, and this is SDRAM. So they're completely different memory technologies. And hypothetically, you could have things that were keyed the same, but were not compatible. But at least hooking them up to a system wouldn't burn anything out and damage anything. I also have a DEC Alpha system that uses DIMMs. And it has been a great many years since I've been in that system. And I don't remember what the memory keying is of that. Someday I'm gonna dig that beast out. It's like a 5U rack mount system, and it weighs, I don't know, 1,000,000 pounds. It is super heavy. Eventually I'm going to dig it out, and it will make an appearance on the channel. I don't know when. It also uses DIMMs, and I think that they're keyed even differently than these, because I do remember that it is probably fast page mode. I don't even think it was EDO, because it's a 21164 processor. Now, there were some Super Socket 7 motherboards, I believe, that could take either DRAM or SDRAM, depending on whichever you had, but SDRAM was much faster. And this notching madness continues on. So jumping ahead a couple of generations, here we've got DDR2, a very slow PC 5300, and here we have another DDR2 PC 5300, but you can see they are notched differently, and there are a bunch of different notch positions available for DDR2 memory. So this would be standard PC kind of DDR2, and this is a fully buffered DDR2. These would be used in server machines primarily, and Power Mac G5s use these. I think that's what I actually got this RAM from. The disadvantage of buffering, and the reason they weren't all just buffered, was in addition to there being more chips, which I don't know, maybe you can kind of see in there and see that there is some more hardware in there. It adds a little bit of latency. The memory is a little bit slower as far as I'm aware. But, and I am not 100% sure why, it allows larger DIMMs. So this is for normal DDR2 memory, the largest capacity DIMM, not SODIMM. SODIMMs could get bigger, but the largest capacity DIMM was 2 gigabytes. Whereas with the fully buffered DIMMs, I mean, obviously 4 gigabyte modules are available. I think even 8 might be. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. So there was, like with most things in engineering, there's trade-offs. But what about before this? Right? And that's why I kind of said I was getting ahead of myself. What was, if DIMMs are the good times, what were the bad times? What were the bad old days like? Well, let me tell you, the bad old days were a mess. They were a mess. Even what came immediately before DIMMs were quite a bit better. The big thing that DIMMs have is, and especially you can see it on both this SDRAM module and this DDR2 module, is this little guy right here. This chip is what enables SPD, or Serial Presence Detect. This is a little serial EEPROM that contains all the statistics about this memory module. So you plug it in, and the motherboard says, hey, how are you doing? What can you do? And this thing tells it. It tells it all this stuff that's on this label here is in this chip. And it communicates that to the motherboard. So the motherboard knows how to set up all the timings, and the timings have gotten massively complicated. There's a lot of things, and it just keeps getting crazier. So this was a huge step forward. And we'll see that with the other things that had come before this, that adding the serial presence detect was kind of like, that was the last thing that we needed. And that's why people have been satisfied with this kind of memory since the late 90s. But let's walk back a little bit in time. In the really old days of microcomputers, you had sort of, by really old days of microcomputers, I mean the late 1970s, you had sort of two classes of computers. You had systems like this Heathkit computer, which I've shown on the channel before, and the CAMM and other sort of really, really primitive systems, right? I mean, there's not much that this can do or that you can do with it. And these systems were generally, they had a fixed amount of RAM in them, or you could solder, right? I could upgrade the RAM in this. I could upgrade it to megabytes if I wanted, but I would have to completely implement it myself because this processor can only access 64K. I would have to implement my own bank switching mechanism so that only parts of the RAM would be accessible at a time. But as many dollars as I would be willing to spend on RAM, I could put in this system. And the same way with the CAMM. And people did. People did all kinds of crazy stuff with the CAMM and with systems like this. The other option that existed in the 70s were systems like the TRS-80 Model 1 that was generally fixed, but if you were willing to basically go out and buy another computer to connect to your computer, you could have more RAM. Or there were a variety of systems that had expansion card slots. And by and large, so like the Apple II, for example, the Apple II or the SWT, Southwest Technical Systems PC. I don't remember the full acronym. Adrian Black did a bunch of videos about one that he has not too long ago. And these systems had card slots in them that were basically wired directly to the processor bus. Like this wasn't, there wasn't a protocol per se of how peripherals communicated. You just plugged directly into the CPU, and because of that, the CPU could communicate with peripherals basically at full speed, because honestly, full speed wasn't that fast. I mean, a couple megahertz tops. So you could connect RAM directly to the CPU over these expansion buses, and you could get additional memory that way. And, in fact, some systems like the TI-99, you did both, right? You had this giant box, the peripheral expansion bay, that you had to get that was a computer that you hooked up to your computer. And then inside that, there was a card slot where you would put a RAM expansion, right? So it's just like, let's put a trash fire on top of a tire fire, and then we'll have a tornado to come and destroy a trailer park at the same time. And that thing of having expansion cards to add RAM, that held on for a really, really long time, and it got even messier from there. This Intel above board hails from the 286, very early 386 sort of era, and there were a lot of boards like this available, easy for me to say, for PCs of the time. And this was sort of a common story that a lot of them had, where you had some kind of RAM expansion and some sort of extra peripherals. This one adds a serial port and a parallel port. The cooler ones could do all sorts of neat tricks. You can see this has a large number of switches to configure both how much RAM is on it and how the RAM is utilized. So this particular card could utilize some of the RAM for a large print buffer. So you could send a whole bunch of stuff off and it would slowly chug out to the printer. Now what this board, and this, So it did two things. One, it could add additional, I believe that it could add additional base memory to the system, to the low 640K. It could add, I believe, it's been a long time since I've actually used this. I believe that on 286s, it could add XMS. So the 286 has a 24-bit address bus, so you could add RAM that is directly addressable by the processor. The remainder of the RAM was this neat thing that PCs had for quite a long time called EMS, which was basically bank switching for PCs. There were some of these kinds of memory boards that would work in 8-bit expansion slots. So they would work with 8088 and 8086 based systems. And they gave them the ability to have more RAM, where a portion of the address space fairly high up in the accessible, addressable, 1 megabyte was set aside, and on a RAM board like this, some set of 4K blocks of this RAM could be mapped into those pages in the high address space. So hypothetically, I think the last version of EMS supported 8 or 16 megabytes additional. Now this particular board is ridiculous madness times 2 because it's a memory expansion board, and these little headers let you install a memory expansion on, yes, it's a memory expansion for your memory expansion. And this is a board, I acquired this one maybe a couple years ago. This is one that I actually used briefly back in the day, and this is fully kitted out. I want to say this is 4 megabytes between the memory directly on the board and this extra thing. It's actually, looking at it and kind of quickly counting in my head, this is going to be 1.5 megabytes here, because these are probably 256K banks. So you get, well, how is that? Yeah. So this will be 1.5 megabytes, and then this will be 2 megabytes. So you could add a whopping 3.5 megabytes, which, going from 640K to 640K plus 3.5 megabytes is pretty amazing. I don't even want to think about how much this amount of RAM would have cost back in the day. I mean, it must have been, this board fully populated out, right? Because the boards weren't cheap, the RAM wasn't cheap, the extra board wouldn't have been cheap. I mean, this was hundreds of dollars, if not $1,000. Like, this would have been insanely expensive. This is also going to bring to light another thing to complain about with old memory, is often, even if you had an expansion card like this that you would plug into your PC, I'm going to ignore the hell of configuring all these jumpers. The manual for this board is a small book, and it goes on and on and on for pages about how to configure these jumpers to do all the different things that you can do with it, and then how to configure the software, the DOS drivers, to go along with that. But you might notice there's a lot of chips on here. And when you bought the board, it probably came like this. Some of them may have come completely bare. And so you had to buy these chips separately. And I have a tube of these chips that I'm going to show here in a moment. And then individually put all of them in and make sure they're all facing the correct direction, and make sure that all the pins are in right and that there isn't a pin slipped out or a pin folded under, or there was a lot that could go wrong, right? There were a lot of times of you'd set it up, you'd get this board, and I did this with this board, Because I think when I got this, there was multiple of these, and so I scrounged chips to fully populate this one out. I think I basically got a bunch of these boards from e-waste, is my memory, and I cobbled it together to make one that was fully populated out, and then I had some that were very minimally configured that I sold. You get it all set up the way you think, all right, this is golden, let's go. You put it in, and nothing. Like, okay, is the software configured wrong? Are the jumpers set wrong? Is there one pin that's somewhere out? There are so much potential for problems that can take an absurd amount of time to try to debug. And then once you've got it figured out, like, it might be a super pain in the behind to fix even. Right? It turns into, just setting up a computer back in the day with boards like these would have been, a troubleshooting video on YouTube. Like, just, well, I got a PC, I need to get it set up. Here's my 45-minute long video with piles of edits of how I did that. And on boards like this, even the kind of RAM chips had to be correct. I've got several boards kind of like this, and I didn't dig any of them out yet, for the Amiga that would go in an Amiga 2000 or an Amiga 3000 that take DIP DRAMs. Some of them even take DIP DRAMs that are this same physical package size and number of pins, but that doesn't guarantee that they're compatible, because the memory, there'll be two numbers that describe the capacity of individual memory chips. One is how many bits wide it is. So when the computer accesses it, how many bits physically come out when you tell it, hey, I want to read from you, how many bits physically come out of it. Now I can tell just by looking at how this is organized that each one of these gives 1 bit. But it's also common, so Amiga 2091 hard drive controller boards, which many Amiga 2000s have, use memory chips that are 4 bits wide, which is much more convenient for that configuration, because as a 16-bit computer, then you only need 4 of them to be able to get 16 bits accessible at a time. With chips like this, you'd need 16 to be the natural data size that the processor wants to communicate with. And because this was going over a bus, these happen to be installed in pairs of columns, but I think they could be installed individually, 256K at a time, which I'm looking at these. Yeah, so the numbers are really hard to read on these, but the specific model is HM50256, which is the other number, 256, and that's how many memory cells there are in it. So the total capacity of these chips is the number of memory cells multiplied by the width. So it takes 8 of these 256 by 1 chips to make 256K. If they were 256 by 4, it would only take 4 of them. Or, pardon me, it would take 2 of them. Math is hard. Okay, so I'm going to move off from this to a different board, and I can see that the battery in my camera, in this camera, is dying. So I'm also going to change the battery before it actually dies, and I'm sad and have to curse loudly. Some memory would come in kits when it was a bunch of dips, and this is an example. So this may be hard to read. Compact 386/16 1 meg kit. So this is all of this RAM is 1 megabyte. So these are, I'm gonna guess that there's gonna be 36 chips in this, because they're probably by 1 memory modules. But check that out. $599 for 1 megabyte that then when you get it home, you've got to try to put all these chips into your motherboard. And oh yeah, while you're at it, don't bend a pin. Don't mess any of it up. Because, you know, I don't know what year this is. I'm going to see if I can see through here to see what... There's a readable date code. 88? 89. 8952. So the tail end of 1989. That actually seems very high, like a very high price, because not very long after that, I bought a pair of 4 megabyte Sims for less money than this. Oh, I guess maybe it was maybe like 3 years after that. So, okay. Is this a crazy price? If you were buying memory chips back in the beginning of 1990, would you have paid that? I mean, you may have wept, perhaps uncontrollably, but would you have paid that? I'm gonna just this is exactly how I got this, and I'm gonna leave this intact like this because it's both absurd and very, very cool. I really like this. I want to keep this preserved in time. I'm not going to leave the Amiga out of this. I get to complain about Amigas as well. So this is a memory expansion. This would have been for an Amiga 500. It would have had a plastic housing around it, and it would have attached to the side expansion slot on the 500. Again, this also is, you know, a memory expansion card that you have to put individual RAM on it, and you have to use jumpers to configure the capacity of it. But this uses a different kind of memory, whereas so the PC expansion boards, this kind of packaging of chips in general is called DIP, or dual inline package, because you've got two lines, two rows of pins. This particular package used here are called zips, for zigzag inline package, and you can see that the rows of pins are staggered. You might also notice they're very close together, and they suck. This is... I'm not going to say that DIPs are the best package, because that implies that there is a good packaging. And I'm not going to go that far, but this is the worst. The pins on these are so fragile, and the pitch is so tight. I had one of these back in the day, which I still have somewhere. This one was just more easily accessible, and I literally snapped pins off of these trying to get them inserted, and the pins would get bent a little bit and go between the sockets, or go in the wrong socket, or get folded over, or... Oh, so much rage for this tiny package. And, you know, it's not good. Like this, I can cut Supra a little bit of slack for doing it on here, because they wanted to be able to fit this. This could take up to 8 megabytes. So in order to do that, they really needed to be able to pack the RAM in here pretty tightly to fit in this small package. And this was the only practical way to do that. Now, I will not cut Commodore any slack, because they also used those memory modules. So this is a very stripped down parts Amiga 3000 motherboard. There's almost none of the chips are left on it. This is the main system RAM on it. And you can see there's basically twice as many of these. And whereas, so the zips that are used on the Super card, because it was going with an Amiga 500 that is going to use a 16-bit data bus. There's 4-bit wide chips. You have to install them in groups of 4. The Amiga 3000, on the other hand, is a 32-bit 68030 processor. So you had to install them in groups of 8. And they didn't all get grouped together. I want to say that it was staggered out like this, but it might have been grouped together. I don't know. I have another Amiga 3000 around here somewhere that is full. Also, just why? I'm just going to ask why. Because by the time they shipped this and made people do this nonsense, these were available. Now, this only holds up to 16 megabytes. Now, these are 30-pin SIMs. This also is 16 megabytes. They very easily could have put, right in here, they could have put 2 pair of SIM sockets, and yes, that means that all 4 of them would have needed to be populated. So being able to sort of gradually upgrade a few megabytes at a time wouldn't have been a thing. Okay, but I still feel like that's better than what they did with the, and even with the follow-on to this was the Amiga 3000T, which was basically the same system. I think the motherboard was different, but it went in this giant tower case, and there was they could have sorted it out for that, but nope, they stuck with the zips until the Amiga 4000, when they very sensibly went to 72-pin SIMs, but I don't feel like they did that very well either. But that's a different story. That's a different rant. Now, Commodore wasn't the only ones to do weird stuff with RAM expansion. Now, before I transition off of zips, I don't fully hate on zips. Like I had mentioned with the Super expansion card, it has a purpose. So, for example, this ATI VGA card uses some zips on it. And some are soldered on and some are in sockets. And that's really what zips are good for. Because they get the chip off the motherboard, you can pack a lot more chips into the same amount of board space, which means you can get higher memory capacity. And really, if it's a robot doing it and putting them in and soldering it on, like, none of the things that I complain about matter anymore because the robot does it, right? And it just works out. Now, there are 4 on here that presumably some human had to try to get into these sockets without bending the pins, but, it was 4, right? And there are a lot of video cards from this era and like the VESA local bus era that used zips for the same reason, to be able to just pack more memory into a smaller amount of board space. Now, Commodore wasn't the only one, as I started to mention, that used a weird and very not user-friendly memory packaging format. So I have this very loudly packaged I have this 386 motherboard, and I showed this once before. Whoa, that was neat. I kicked the power switch. I showed this very briefly in my pickups video from my trip to California and to the Vintage Computing West Festival. Vintage Computing Festival West. Yes, that's the name. So this is a 386 motherboard, so roughly the same sort of generation of hardware. And at first glance, you'll think that these are SIMs, but then when you look closer, the slots are just rows of pins. Now, this particular kind of memory is called SIP, SIPP, which I'm going to guess is single inline pin package. I'm going to guess. And you know, honestly, I had a 286. In fact, the 286 that I had those Intel Above boards in back in the day that used SIPs. And they kind of have all of the same advantages and disadvantages as zips. Like, these pins are super fragile, which is why I'm not going to take these out to show them. They are super fragile. They're very easy to bend. And if one of them snaps off, it's straight to the bin. But also because they don't have, I can show. So I'll talk a little bit more about these bizarre devices. So because you don't have this large socket taking up space, you can fit these memory modules much closer together. And they also have the advantage of you can just forego this pin header and just solder them directly onto the board. I've seen a couple of videos. I think it was another one of Adrian Black's videos where he had this. It was an AI accelerator card for a PC from back in the day that was basically a 386 computer on an ISA card, and it had, I want to say it had sockets for these for like 40 megabytes or something. Or maybe it was, I think it was, no, I take it back. It was 24 megabytes. So it had 24 of these sockets. Right, now think about that. An ISA card this size that has got 20 of these sockets just packed in together, you for sure would not have been able to fit 20 of these sockets in the same amount of board real estate. And so, you know, in the same amount of space that this board goes to extremes to get 3.5 megabytes, being able to pack in 24 megabytes, like, it absolutely makes sense. Was totally the right choice. For the regular expansion on your motherboard, jerks. Just total jerks. Because these, and these are basically just, they're just 30-pin SIMs where someone has soldered little pokey pins onto the ends. That's really all these are. Like, just, so 30-pin SIMs, and this is one of the weird things about 30-pin SIMs. And when they came along, this was great. This was great. But one of the things about them is when computers started using these, every computer was at least 16 bits. And these are 8 bits wide, which means you need at least pairs of them. Now, this 386 is 32 bits, so you need them in groups of 4. So this particular board, these are, I looked through the manual, it can take 8 1 megabyte SIPs, which is common. So, like, I don't know. It seems like they could have made a slightly different module that would have been at least 16 bits wide. Because, and I actually didn't grab out a module, I just grabbed these. So this is, if you want to talk about bad memory upgrades, here you go. So if you're upgrading from a 386 that sensibly uses 30-pin SIMs to a 46 that uses 72-pin SIMs, well, you don't want to just throw all your memory away, because the RAM is physically the same memory technology, it's just a different package. So you put 4 of these on this cartridge and then put this in the 72-pin SIM slot on the board, and now you've adapted it. Right? So it seems like at the time when these were available, it should have been reasonable to make something in between, something that was 16 bits wide that was roughly this size package. I don't know. Maybe there were some technical limitations. I don't know. I was, in high school or something back then, so I wasn't in the trenches. Now, there are also boards like this it was very common to buy very low density modules. So these are 4 megabyte 30-pin SIMs, which is about the largest anyone. 16 megabyte were possible. They were unbelievably expensive, and they are now super rare because of that. So 4 megabyte is the practical largest size. There were 2 megabyte ones. I have seen those before in a Mac 2 of some, or Mac LC? Yeah, Mac LC. Had 2 megabyte SIMs, which I thought was super bizarre. It's a weird configuration, but 4 megabyte, 1 megabyte, and 256K were sort of the common sizes. So if you had bought, say in the 72-pin era, if you had bought a bunch of 1 megabyte SIMs and now you wanted more than what your motherboard could physically hold of 1 megabyte SIMs, there are actually adapters like this that you put other 72-pin SIMs into. So if you put 4 1 megabyte 72-pin SIMs in this kind of a thing, it's now a enormous 4 megabyte 72-pin SIM that you put in and sticks up, 10 miles out of the board in total ridiculousness. Now I actually am going to have to. So that's an interesting thing that I didn't. So this must be hardwired for a specific size of SIMs to put in it, because so with 30-pin SIMs, the computer has no idea how big it is. You either need to set jumpers on the motherboard or on whatever board to tell it, or the boot firmware on the system could probe the memory modules using the CPU to try to figure out how big they were by trying to access them in certain ways. And like, okay, well, when I get out here and try to access this address range, certain things happen. So there's no memory there. These must be this capacity. 72-pin SIMs improved on that, and you can look at the modules. There'll usually be some sort of pads on the modules that connect to these pins, and the pads will either be disconnected between them, or I want to say they'll typically have like a 0 ohm resistor in between them. So they'll either be open or they'll have a 0 ohm resistor between them. And so by the configuration of, by this is essentially going to give a 4-bit value. So you've got 16 possible combinations that tells the system both what the capacity is, and depending on whose system it is, indicates what speed it is. I think IBM had somewhere some values meant this was an 8 megabyte 80 nanosecond SIM or 8 megabyte 70 nanosecond SIM based on the configurations of these pads. And when this came out, so these were 32 bits wide. Most computers were 32 bits. We were sort of right on the brink of the Pentium era, where things, where the memory bus first stepped up to be 64 bits wide. And then since then, it's just gotten wider and wider and wider. And now you have to install 4 or 6 modules at a time, and those modules are much wider, and so it's kind of gone crazy. But I mean, that's the processor needs to be fed. It's very hungry for data. So this was a huge step forward. Well, I mean, not this specifically, but 72-pin SIMs in general were a huge step forward over these. And then when we finally get to the DIMMs, they were a massive but incremental improvement over the technologies that came before it. And certainly did away with all of this madness. Now, pretty much any PC you get is going to take some sort of generation of memory technology, and as long as you get the right performance and the right buffering, there's very, very small number of things that you have to worry about. It's going to work. And if you have another system that's the same-ish generation, you can probably take memory from one to the other and have a reasonable expectation that it's just going to work. That was not always the way. That has been, for a lot of computing, that was not how things worked out. It was all of this madness. And, you know, I didn't even talk about how on like this Amiga 3000, you got 2 different kinds of memory and you had to pick which packaging you wanted. So it wasn't even within a system. There was madness. And this was common. The 386SX board that I used in my 486 build-off has a similar thing where it has 72-pin SIM slots and DIP sockets, and you use one or the other. You know, and there were a number of boards that had, from transitional periods, that had 32-pin SIM sockets and 72-pin SIM sockets, and you'd use one or the other. I actually have a board that will come up, hopefully not too much longer, where you have to use both. The 30-pin SIM sockets and the 72-pin SIM sockets to get the full memory capacity. I could not even believe when I read that in the manual. I could not. I could not even believe that that was real. But we've had this relative time of peace with the with DIMMs for so long that all of this madness is just kind of barely even a memory. So I'm going to come back. The rest of December is going to be chock full of DOS and Doom content. It is going to be combination DOS-sember and Doom-sember. And yes, I'm just talking to the hands camera because I switched batteries and that battery, oh no, the battery didn't die. It got up to the maximum recording capacity because I wouldn't shut up. That's what happened. That's why the other camera shut off and I kind of abruptly changed. Yes, I am planning to buy a new camera for myself for Christmas. Anyway, lots of DOS and Doom content. And I have got some really, really cool videos planned. I'm super excited. Please click the like button for this video if you enjoyed it. If you are interested in seeing more content like this or more of that DOS or Doom content that's coming up, click the subscribe button. I am on Twitter and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And until next time, try to remember the good stuff.